The 19th century was a pivotal period for Afghanistan as a political state. Emerging out of the dying embers of the Durrani Empire, the state fought hard for its existence, first in the shape of civil wars between contenders, and then surviving a British invasion during the First Anglo-Afghan War. Thanks in part to the diligence and acumen of Amir Dost Mohammad Khan, by the 1870s, Afghanistan seemed to have a semblance of political stability that could be used as a platform from which to embrace the modernization of the country. But Afghanistan's destiny would be interrupted as the country became embroiled in the rivalry between Britain and Imperial Russia once again. In 1878, British India would invade the mountainous country for the second time in 40 years, this time hoping to learn from the mistakes it had made the first time. In the years following Britain's withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1842, the Russians had steadily expanded their border southward in Central Asia. During the 1860s and 70s, the Russian Empire had swallowed up the city-states of Khiva, Khokhand, Bukhara, and Tashkent. By 1876, all that remained between the Russian Empire in Central Asia and the British in India was the Emirate of Afghanistan. This was a huge problem for the British. There had been British politicians who criticized the exaggerated fear of Russian expansion that led up to the First Anglo-Afghan War. But by the 1870s, those criticisms seemed irresponsible in light of Russian aggression in the region. The British were well aware of the Russian desire for a warm water port, something which would have required them to gain access to the Indian Ocean, a move that would undoubtedly have undermined the British position in India. To give further impetus to the prospect of a showdown in the Great Game, key changes took place within British politics in the 1870s. Benjamin Disraeli of the Conservative Party had defeated William Gladstone of the Liberals in the 1874 British elections. The new Prime Minister held a much more adventurous outlook on foreign policy than his predecessor, and sought to take a more head-on approach to countering Russian expansion. The British were not the only ones worried by these developments. The Afghan Emir, Sher Ali Khan, was keen on maintaining neutrality in the rivalry between the two colonial powers. He had shown signs of being interested in bringing reforms to Afghanistan, such as a basic postal service and military modernization. But the 19th century was a dangerous time to be an Afghan ruler. Large parts of his reign were focused on him just maintaining the security of his position. He had come to power in 1863 after the long reign of his father, Amir Dost Mohammad Khan. But just 3 years into his reign, Sher Ali Khan was forced into exile by his brother, Muhammad Afzal Khan. Crucially, Sher Ali Khan spent his time in exile in Bukhara, where with the help of Russian aid, he was able to recapture his throne in 1868. This detail would prove problematic for the British to stomach when the Emir would later profess his neutrality. Even upon regaining his throne, Sher Ali's internal security woes continued. His son Yaqub had organized a failed revolt against him, for which he landed in prison. But Sher Ali's other son, Abdullah, had proven himself to be capable and was favored by his father to succeed him. The first obvious step on the path to the Second Anglo-Afghan War occurred in 1878 when Lord Lytton, the new Viceroy of India and Prime Minister Disraeli's protege, sent the Emir a letter insisting that the rebellious Yaqub be announced as his heir instead of Abdullah. Why the British preferred one son over the other is unclear, but nevertheless, Leighton suffixed the request with a dire threat, saying, "We can pour an army into your country before any Russian soldier can help you." The letter also informed the Emir that an envoy was coming to Kabul to talk over the matter. Sher Ali, after deliberately waiting an infuriating amount of time, informed the British that he would choose his own successor, and that no such envoy shall come, but instead he would send his own men to Calcutta to talk over these demands. When the Afghan Emir's men arrived in the capital of the Raj, the British had no interest in a discussion. Instead, they listed a harsh set of demands that would have essentially transformed Afghanistan into an autonomous region within the British Empire. Sher Ali apparently flew into a rage upon hearing the terms, immediately rejecting them. He tried to reinforce his expressed desire to remain neutral and independent of the Russian and British rivalry. But his words were undermined by the fact that, unbeknownst to him, an uninvited Russian delegation had crossed into Afghanistan in July of 1878 and wanted to meet with the Emir directly. Even though Sher Ali tried to get the Russians to turn back and leave his country, his efforts proved futile. This confirmed the suspicions of the British in Calcutta. As Sher Ali was watching his country edge closer to war, tragedy hit his house. His son and favoured successor Abdullah died, sending the ruler into a state of grief which he never really recovered from. Regardless of this, the British demanded that the Emir should accept an envoy of their own to Kabul. Sher Ali ordered that the British mission be turned back at the Khyber Pass if it arrived, and that's exactly what happened in September 1878. With a Russian delegation in Kabul and a refusal to accept a British one, Lord Leighton was now convinced that the Emir had chosen a side. This episode and the subsequent refusal of the Emir to apologize for his actions was the spark to the pile of gunpowder and triggered the official declaration of war from Britain. In November 1878, a British force of roughly 40,000 men, mainly Indians, prepared to invade Afghanistan. The army was to be split into 3 columns, with one being tasked to march through the Bolan Pass and seize Kandahar in the west. A second column was responsible for securing the Khyber Pass before advancing on Jalalabad in the east, whilst the third column advanced along the Kuram Valley towards Kabul in the center. In the Khyber, the invading column was met with resistance by Afghan forces at the fortress of Ali Masjid. The result was a swift British victory, something which was replicated at the Battle of Paiwar Kotal in the Kuram Valley a few weeks later. Just these 2 battles alone more or less ensured that the British path to Kabul was secure. And so Amir Sher Ali Khan decided to go north and ask the Russians for help. A request that was turned down by the Tsar's men, who instead encouraged him to seek peace talks with the invading force. At this point, the beleaguered Amir gave up. He came down with a fever and had a leg injury that turned gangrenous. The whole while he refused any medical aid, food and water. He would die a few weeks later in February 1879. The Afghan throne then passed to his rebellious son, Yaqub. Immediately, he repaid the British trust in him. He ordered the Afghan troops to stand down and let the British peacefully march to Kabul. The first phase of the Second Anglo-Afghan War had been concluded. The Emir went in person to meet the British before they reached the capital, in the small town of Gandamak, where he famously signed the notorious Treaty of Gandamak in May 1879. According to this agreement, the Emir was to receive an annual subsidy from the British, as well as assurances of assistance in case of foreign aggression. In return, the Afghans had to pay a steep price. Yaqub Khan was to relinquish control of Afghan foreign affairs to the British Viceroy in India. He also had to accept a British mission to reside in Kabul, and perhaps most seriously, give the British jurisdiction over strategic chunks of territory such as the Kuram Pass, Pishin and Sibi in what would eventually become the northwestern frontier province and Baluchistan. The British mission was headed by two individuals, Neville Bowles-Chamberlain, an ancestor of the future British Prime Minister in the 1930s, and Sir Louis Cavenari. In July, both men, along with the entire British mission, entered Kabul on elephants, waving to the unimpressed crowd, and took up residence near the historic Bala Hisar. The Emir ensured that his British allies were doted upon lavishly and given the utmost hospitality. But the ordinary Afghans who were witnessing foreigners entering their capital triumphantly were not so warm and welcoming. This feeling extended to the Afghan troops who had gone unpaid for months because they were told there was a lack of funds, while they stood helplessly and watched the Emir spend money on his new foreign friends. Even at this stage, Cavenari had noticed the discontented murmurings of the Afghan natives. Even so, on September 2nd, 1879, he sent a letter back to Calcutta reporting everything to be well in Afghanistan. One day later, he was dead. It all began with a rumour. A contingent of unhappy soldiers had gone to Cavenari because they were told he had the funds to pay them. The soldiers broke into the British residency and began looting. This was seen by Kabuli civilians who promptly joined in as the dislike for the British had reached its boiling point. Cavenari, who for all intents and purposes seemed like quite a pompous man, believed he was well equipped to deal with the tribal Afghans considering his previous experience with the Pashtuns of the frontier. So he decided to exhibit a show of strength that he thought would impress the Afghans by climbing onto the roof and shouting down at the crowd. The angry crowd was not impressed by this lame display of courage. Now, Cavenari switched gears and ordered his few troops to fire on the angry mob. The 70 or so members of the British Residency were cut down by the thousands of angry Afghans. And so began the second phase of the war. One of the three columns of British troops that had invaded the country, led by Major General Frederick Roberts, stormed towards the capital, dispatched any tribal forces that had gathered around, and took control of Kabul. There was some confusion as to whether Amir Yaqub Khan was to be allowed to remain as Amir. For all they knew, he conspired in the assassination of Cavenari, which was not the case. The Amir resolved this debate himself, asking to be relieved of his position, and so he was sent to India to live on a modest pension. The former Amir supposedly said, "I would rather cut grass in the British camp than to be Amir of Afghanistan." The Union Jack was hoisted over the Bala Hisar fort. The British were going to rule directly until a new puppet Amir could be found. Then began the retribution. Major General Roberts took it upon himself to punish the Afghans for the killing of Cavenari, and so the citizens of Kabul were fined, some imprisoned, and several hung for their crimes. Forts and villages were razed in order to reinforce to the Afghan chieftains who was in charge. In hindsight, this caused a swelling of anger in the country instead of the desired effect of instilling fear. Whispers of Islam itself being attacked had started to circulate, and the British consummation of pig meat was a common way to get the crowds riled up. It was clear that the war was not over yet. But Afghanistan did not have an effective army. The army they did have was handily defeated at almost every corner, and so the use of regimented lines and order was thrown out of the window. Instead, the use of guerrilla warfare was the adopted strategy of farmers and tribesmen for whom fighting was not a profession but a way of life. Their fighting spirit was boosted by clerics across the countryside, such as the 90-year-old Mushki Alam, who urged Afghans to defend Islam by ridding the country of the British. Even though the guerrilla warfare was largely ineffective in terms of winning battles, it was still a grave annoyance to the British army. For instance, Major General Roberts once travelled 300 miles in 20 days with 10,000 men in the Afghan summer to relieve an Afghan siege of Kandahar. This was an amazing achievement of organisation and endurance. The only issue is, when Roberts got to Kandahar, the Afghans had already lifted the siege. So the problem for the British was not winning battles, because they had won almost every single one. The problem was the Afghans kept fighting, regardless of losing battles. Therefore, the war in Afghanistan just became a money pit which was swallowing up British India's resources. At this stage, the British started entertaining the idea of partitioning Afghanistan in a way that would benefit them. Several plans were proposed, which included the annexation of Kandahar or handing Herat over to Persia. Ultimately, the plan to partition Afghanistan was shelved for a variety of reasons, chief amongst them being the return of the Liberals to power in Britain in the spring of 1880. The returning Prime Minister William Gladstone had been a vocal critic of Benjamin Disraeli's policy towards Afghanistan and favoured a less aggressive solution. But before all of that was to be decided upon, Ayub Khan, another son of Sher Ali Khan, stormed down from Herat and led 8,000 men into the field of Maiwand, near Kandahar, where his forces attacked a 2,500 strong British force. In the west, Maiwand is best known as the battle in which the fictional Dr. Watson was wounded before he met Sherlock Holmes in the famous stories by Arthur Conan Doyle. In Afghanistan, the battle has become a symbol of national pride since the Afghans won decisively, inflicting almost 1,000 casualties on the British. According to Afghan folklore, it is said that as the Afghan line began to give way, a young woman named Malali, aged 18 or 19, grabbed the bloodied flag of her people, raised it high and shouted in Pashto, "Young love, if you do not fall in the Battle of Maiwand, by God someone is saving you as a symbol of shame." In the midst of the battle, Malali was killed, but her words and actions had spurred on her countrymen to victory. Since then, Malali has become Afghanistan's iconic heroine, its Joan of Arc. Ayub Khan tried to use the momentum of this victory to retake the city of Kandahar, but Major General Roberts had made his incredible journey to defend the city that we mentioned previously. When the Battle of Kandahar finally did take place on September 1st, 1880, it ended with a decisive British victory and Ayub Khan's army was in retreat. The Second Anglo-Afghan War was now over. The British had to decide what to do with Afghanistan. In the end, they settled on keeping the country whole and selecting Abdurrahman Khan as the new Emir. Son of a former Emir and cousin to Ayub Khan, Abdurrahman was a somewhat surprising candidate, considering he had spent 11 years exiled in Russian-controlled Central Asia. But he was going to be a perfect fit. The new ruler, who would go on to become known as the Iron Emir, accepted all the key British conditions. He did, however, express that the British must not interfere with the internal affairs of his country. As a result of reinforcing the Treaty of Gandamak, the new Emir forfeited control of his country's foreign affairs, so the British were happy to oblige to his demand. The very next year in 1881, Ayub Khan tried to retake Kandahar from his cousin, but was defeated and subsequently fled the country. Just like his brother Yaqub, Ayub would eventually be exiled in India, where he became a pensioner of the British. As for the Russians, besides the potentially dangerous Panjdeh incident in 1885, they never again mingled with Afghanistan's affairs. In terms of who won the war, it's tough to tell. Both sides gained something from the conflict. The Afghans gained clarity and a peace of mind that the British would not intervene in its domestic affairs, whilst the British gained a neutral buffer state between itself and its rival Russia. But both sides paid dearly for what they received as well. The British lost men and resources, whilst the Afghans had their sovereignty undermined by the loss of control over its foreign affairs. Not to mention the loss of territory in the south and east, which the Iron Emir would put pen to paper on to make an official border in 1893 under the Durrani Agreement. Thank you guys for watching. Make sure to like, comment and subscribe to keep up to date with my latest videos. As usual, I want to thank my patrons for their generosity and support throughout the years. If you want to support the channel, there's a link to my Patreon in the description to this video. And before I go, I also want to thank the talented Lidda Afghan for her awesome drawing of Malali of Maiwand. I'll leave her Instagram details in the description below. Make sure you check out her work. Until next time, peace.